Your minds were in gear as we read those verses. And if so, you may have asked yourself the question, where is this sermon going? And if you asked yourself that question, that's a good thing. It means you were engaged and your minds were not floating off into neutral. There are several things that I hoped you noticed from those verses. First of all, the most holy place was very sacred, and it was set apart. Secondly, the presence of God filled that place. And thirdly, the most holy place was shielded from careless or casual entry. Now, we're not planning to stay in the Old Testament tabernacle today. We read those verses as a springboard to launch us into another subject. And if you already made a connection between the text that was read and the title that is printed in the bulletin, good for you. That means you're a bright student and you deserve some extra credit. If you did not make that connection, that's okay too. I'll try to help you to make that connection. So the verses we read were about God's temple. A question for you: where or what is God's temple today? Somebody respond. In your heart. Okay. The word I was thinking of is in our bodies. In the Old Testament, God had a temple for his people. In the New Testament, God has his people for a temple. 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20 says, "Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you? Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." And 2 Corinthians 6:16 says, "Ye are the temple of the living God." So the first question is, where or what is God's temple today? Now the second question may be a little bit more subjective. Our text was about a specific part of the tabernacle, the most holy place. So if our bodies in general are God's temple, what do you think might be the most holy place of that temple? What comes to your mind? The mind. Okay. I appreciate that response. I'll not wait for more because that's the response I was looking for. I'd like to propose that the most holy place in God's temple may be our minds. Romans 8:6 says, "For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace." 2 Corinthians 4, verse 4, "The God of this world hath blinded the minds of them which believe not. And if the influence of the world enters and infiltrates and controls our minds, it blinds us to the things of God." And if that happens, we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, as it tells us in Romans 12, verse 2. So in the Old Testament times, the most holy place of the tabernacle was without doubt the holiest place on earth. There was no place equal to that in holiness anywhere. And if your body is the temple of God today, is your mind the most holy place, the holiest place on earth today? I may not be able to state with certainty that is the case, but I think it's definitely an idea to consider and an idea I'd like to develop farther this morning. 1 Peter chapter 1, several statements from verses 13 to 16. "Therefore gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober, as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, 'Be holy, for I am holy.'" And these verses make it clear that holiness begins in our minds. Therefore, gird up the loins of your minds. And it's from this verse that we take the title for our message today. Gird up the loins of your mind. Gird up the loins of your mind. The mental image or the picture that is given here is, picture the attire of the time when men would wear long flowing robes, and if they needed to hurry, they needed to get somewhere quickly. They didn't want those robes to be in the way to run, and they would pull up the hem of those robes and perhaps tuck it into their belt to free them up. And this is not the only place in the scripture where this picture is given. Elisha, speaking to Gehazi, told him on one occasion, "Gird up thy loins, and take my staff in thine hand, and go thy way. If thou meet any man, salute him not, and if any salute thee, answer him not again." In other words, what Elisha was saying here is, don't let anything stop you. Don't let anything hinder you. Don't let anything distract you. Move it. Get moving. Gird up the loins of your mind. And this is what God is saying to us. Don't let anything distract you or hinder you. Focus on your mind. I'd like to look this morning at 5 aspects of the mind. The significance of the mind will be the first one. And then I'd like to look at the idle mind, the protected mind, the disciplined mind, and the renewed mind. So what is the significance of the mind? I would like to propose to you that your mind is the most valuable resource that God has given to you. Now, God has given us a lot of things. We are a blessed people. But think about all the things that are important to you. Family, home, material possessions, finances, friends, future, your job, your reputation, your hobbies. What would these things mean to you if you had no mind? Nothing. What could you do with these things if you had no mind? Nothing. On the other hand, if you would have no friends, or if you would have no money, or if you would have no home, or if you would be handicapped and have no feet or no hands, but you still had a good mind, you still have potential, and you still have hope. There's things you can do. You have options. You see, your mind is critical to anything you do. And of all the things that God gave to you, your mind just may be the most valuable. Your mind affects your actions. Proverbs 23:7 says, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he." As you think. And I think sometimes in the Bible language, it uses the word heart. Sometimes the Bible uses the word mind. And I think sometimes they may be interchangeable. But as a man thinks, that affects who he is. It affects your actions. Intentional change begins in the mind. Romans 8:6 says, "For they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." And if your mind is set on things of the flesh, you will live after the flesh. If your mind is set on things of the Spirit, you will live after the Spirit. Your mind controls your actions. Your mind, because of that, needs to be controlled. This is part of the significance of the mind, because whoever controls your mind controls you. If God controls your mind, God controls you. If Satan controls your mind, he has control of you. And whatever you allow, whatever thoughts you allow to control your mind, will have a control of your life as well. Ephesians 4:22-24 says that ye put off concerning the former conversation the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that ye put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. Did you catch that? We need to be renewed in the spirit of our mind. We need to control it. We need to guard it. I thought of an example as I was thinking about the significance of the mind and how the mind affects our actions, the mind affects what we do. I remember hearing some time ago from a couple young men here in our group that did a Spartan race in the mountains of Vermont. Now, a Spartan race is designed to be grueling and to test the participants. It was a severe test of both physical endurance and of mental endurance. And this particular race was a long loop through rugged terrain that took hours to complete. And I remember hearing that at one point in the race, they could look out ahead and they could see the trail ahead of them. And this trail went up a steep, rocky mountain the whole way to the top. Not only did it go up this steep, rocky mountain, but the participants, as one of the requirements of the race, were carrying heavy bags of sand to add to the challenge. And when they saw that trail going up that steep, rugged mountainside, the natural response was, no way. Impossible. Absolutely not. This is insane. If I can't make it to the top, why should I even start? I may as well quit now. But what those participants could not see from that vantage point was that the course they would run only started up the hill and then went past a large obstacle and actually veered off to the side. And they were not actually running up to the peak of that mountain after all. But the point is that the organizers of that race, which was designed to test people and push them to their limits, they knew that victory is won or lost in the mind. And if they could play with your mind, it would affect. If you give up in your mind, you were done. Successful runners needed to control their minds. I can do this, one step at a time. If I can reach this point, and then this point, and then this point. But runners who lost out mentally lost the race. The runners who were able to gird up the loins of their minds, who were able to control their minds, were the ones who were able to complete the race. And the Christian life is the same way. We need to run with perseverance the race that is set before us, keeping our eyes on Jesus, not on the obstacles or perceived obstacles, but on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, the one who will carry us through. We need to be renewed daily in the spirit of our minds. We need to gird up the loins of our minds. Now, I'd like to consider a bit the idle mind. How much of your brain capacity do you actually use? I remember hearing years ago that the average person only uses 10% of their mental capacity. And I did a little bit of research, and modern studies indicate that this is not true. They're not sure where that statement may have come from. We actually do use more of our mind. But what is true is that exercise helps to develop the mind. And we all find it easy to be lazy. We all like to sit and relax and do nothing with our minds as well as our bodies. The more a person uses the brain, the better their mental functions become. It's developed through exercise. This is also true as we age. Use it or lose it. Last year, in the month of June, Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams left on a trip. This was not an ordinary trip they were taking. This was a trip to the International Space Station. They expected to stay there for 1 week. However, the Starliner spacecraft, which was scheduled to bring them home, developed some problems and was deemed unsafe for them to return on, leaving them stranded in the International Space Station. Now, 9 months later, they're still there. So imagine that. Expect to be gone for a week. 9 months later, they're still there. At this point, they are hoping or scheduled to return in about 2 weeks on March 19th. So for 9 months, these two people have been living in nearly zero gravity. Their bodies do not need to do things that bodies normally need to do here on Earth. In zero gravity, for example, the fluids in your body tend to float upward because gravity does not pull the fluid down. And people soon develop puffy faces and their limbs start to get thinner because of all the fluids just floating upward. After an extended time in zero gravity, bone density decreases because the bones don't need to support the weight of your body, and the bones weaken, and muscles weaken because movement requires little effort, and you're never lifting heavy things. So when someone who has spent extended time like this returns to Earth, they face some challenges. All of a sudden, all these fluids are affected by gravity and tend to go to the lower parts of the body, leaving them dizzy and often with swollen legs to the point that movement can actually be difficult. And the heart will need to learn to work hard again, actually pumping this blood through the body instead of it just kind of floating through the body. Weakened muscles will require therapy to rebuild. And I read an article about these people this week that stated that even simple tasks like lifting a pencil will feel like a strenuous workout. My point is, if you don't use it, you lose it. And the same is true of the mind. We said that your mind may be your most valuable resource. Why would you not use your most valuable resource? It's the most valuable thing you have. You need to use it. So we need to use your head. Secondly, limit your amusements. Now this week I was looking at this word and I found out, discovered something interesting. What does the word amuse actually mean? Well, this word consists of a root word with a prefix in front of it. The root word is muse. Now, we know what muse means. It means to think. You know, you muse about something, you think about something. So what does a prefix a in front of a word mean? Well, it actually changes the meaning to give it the opposite meaning. For example, a theist is someone who believes in God. An atheist or atheist is someone who does not believe in God. So to muse means to think. To amuse means to not think. So amusement is simply something which does not require much thinking. Now, after a hard day of concentration, someone spends all day in school poring over algebra and geometry or chemistry or whatever it might be. They come home, they want to relax their mind. They'll find something different to do for a while. You might amuse yourself by reading or playing a game. But consider how much amusement a lot of people spend their time in. What do you do with your free time? Today, it's so common for people to watch films or video clips, screen time, just browsing, see what comes up next. This is amusement. It is not active thinking. It is the opposite. It is allowing other people to just take your mind wherever they want to. Now, amusement may not be wrong in itself, but too much amusement is a sign of a weak or undisciplined mind. Most of your time should be spent using your mind, not kicking it into neutral. And thirdly, let's avoid an idle mind. One quote that I remember hearing from my mother as a young boy, idleness is the devil's workshop. In fact, that quote was said with such seriousness that at one point I assumed it had a chapter and verse to it, that it was somewhere in the Bible. And the idea was that boys that have too much idle time on their hands get into trouble. Could the same apply to an idle mind? Could we say an idle mind is the devil's workshop? Allowing your mind to wander is to allow it to go places where maybe it should not go. Psalm 2 talks about vain imaginations. It's talking about the heathen, saying they imagine a vain thing, imagining things that aren't or never will be. You know, if we just allow our minds to wander, sometimes I know for myself, I find all these useless fantasizing going on in your mind. You know, you don't have anything you need to concentrate on. What if I would be given $1 million? And you think about what you would do with it or what you could do with it. But you probably won't be given $1 million. Or what if I could control the outcome of every NFL game? Wouldn't that be fun? Well, you won't control the outcome of every NFL game. This is useless fantasizing. It can lead to lustful thinking or revengeful thinking. Luke chapter 11, Jesus gives the example of a man who was possessed by an evil spirit. And in this case, it uses the example of this spirit was taken out and wandering around, not knowing where to go, and he came back to the man from which he left, and he found the house, as it were, swept and cleaned, but not occupied. I said, oh, here's a vacant space. I'll find 7 other spirits more wicked than myself, and we will enter in there. An idle mind is trouble waiting to happen. So keep your mind occupied. Now let's looking on forward at the protected mind. Your mind, we say, is your most precious resource. So if it's something precious, don't give it away. Don't allow it to be invaded. Don't sell it cheap. Protect it. We say your mind is the most holy place in your life. And the most holy place was protected by a thick veil that separated it from the rest of the tabernacle and from the common person. We need to protect the holy place of our minds. Hang a veil to protect our minds. I'd like to look quickly at 7 things from which to protect our minds. And I'll be mentioning these briefly. Every one of these could be developed a lot farther. And this is not an exclusive list. These are just some things that came to my mind this week as I was considering this subject. 7 things from which to protect our minds. Number 1, a spirit of bitterness or unforgiveness. Hebrews 12:15 says, looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Simply telling us that if we allow bitterness to occupy our minds or holding a grudge against someone, not forgiving them, this is going to corrupt our minds. Ephesians 4:31 and 32. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And then it gives us the option. Instead of that, be kind, be tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. We want God to work in our mind. He will not be able to do that as he pleases in the mind of someone who is occupied by bitterness and unforgiveness. This attitude may not occupy the most holy place of our minds. A second thing is the spirit of fear. 2 Timothy 1:7, for God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Not fear, but a sound mind. Hebrews 2:15 says, and deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. If you allow fear to dwell in your mind, it will lead you into bondage. It will hinder your effectiveness, and God will not be able to work as he desires in your life if your mind is filled with fear. this attitude may not occupy the most holy place of our lives. A third thing from which to protect our minds is the love of money. 1 Timothy 6:10, for the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. The love of money will lead you away from a life of holiness. Hebrews 13, verse 5 says, let your conversation or let your lifestyle, your conduct, be without covetousness. The ESV says, let it be without the love of money, and be content with such things as you have. If your mind is occupied by the love of money, God will not be able to work as he desires. A fourth thing, lustful or sensual thinking. Romans 1, verse 27, talks about men who burned in their lust. The NIV says they were inflamed with lust, and the ESV says they were consumed with passion. Now, I find those words interesting. You burn, it grows into a flame, and you're consumed. If we allow even a small spark of lustful thinking to occupy our minds, it will consume us. It will grow into a flame and consume us. 1 John 2, 15 and 16. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. If your mind is filled with lustful thinking, God will not be able to do the work that he desires in your life. Then there are negative thought patterns. You develop this negative thought, and it just kind of feeds and grows. Philippians 4:8 tells us, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, and whatsoever things are of a good report, if there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. Not the negative things, the positive things. Psalm 1, 1 and 2. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the negative things, the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful, who will lead you in a negative way. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. 1 Corinthians 5:15-33 says, be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners. Be careful what thought patterns you allow to influence you. It may corrupt your minds. And this is especially important or especially significant as we relate with our peers. One person says the negative thing. Someone else builds on it. Someone else builds on it. And pretty soon it just snowballs until everyone is thinking negatively. It can happen in the school setting. One person says, our teacher's too strict. Another one, yeah, he gives too much homework. Another one, and he's so boring. And it just grows. It can happen in a workplace. You know, why can't we be provided with this or that? Our boss is getting rich from our work, and why doesn't he pay us more? If you hear comments like that starting, make it a point to turn it around. Throw something positive in there. I remember as a child saying something negative about someone. My mother looked at me and said, now I want you to say 5 good things about that person. If you have one negative thing to say, think of 5 good things to say. Turn around that negative thought. In that race that I was talking about earlier, that Spartan race up the mountain, the people who were running that race could have a tremendous impact on each other. I was talking to Johnny last week, and he said one thing that he was encouraged at the very beginning of that race, he said, is if you find yourself running next to someone who has a negative attitude, if you stick with that person, you're not going to finish the race. You got to separate yourself from them. You got to get those negative thoughts out of your mind. Avoid negative thinking. There's something else that I'd like to mention that I think we need to be careful to protect our minds from. And I have it labeled here as substitute religions. And I'm thinking about some of the Eastern religions and practices like yoga that I think has become much more prominent in recent years. And I want to encourage you, stay far away from these influences. These roots go back to Hindu and Buddhist religions, which seek salvation through the elimination process. And they focus on emptying the mind. And they have this term which they refer to reaching a state of nirvana, if I have it pronounced right. And literally, what that means is blowing out or becoming extinguished. You're just blowing out the thoughts in your mind, just emptying your mind. But it has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus Christ being in control of your mind. We are not to empty our minds and leave them in a void, or the spirits will bring 7 more spirits back and occupy our minds. We need to fill our minds. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Think on these things. Don't allow the evil spirits to occupy an empty mind. Just remember, these practices are dangerous and they can destroy your life. Now, my 7th thing I'm going to suggest here, we're looking at things from which to protect our minds. And the 7th thing I'm going to list in the form of a question. What about AI? Most of you recognize that term. It stands for artificial intelligence. What is artificial intelligence? It's the development of a computer system that's capable of performing tasks that historically only a human could do, such as reasoning, making decisions, or solving problems. For example, I understand that I could give a request to AI. I could tell it, write me a 45-minute sermon on the use of the mind with 3 main points. And it would do exactly that. And I could stand up here and read that sermon to you. Now, don't worry, I didn't do that. But this is what artificial intelligence is all about. And I'd like to just give a few cautions about artificial intelligence. First of all, it has no filters. It gets its info from a myriad of sources. And when you get information from AI, you have no idea where it's coming from. You don't know where that source is. When I do research on a subject, I may find an article on that subject that is written from a Catholic perspective, or maybe a Jewish perspective, or a Muslim perspective, or a Mormon perspective, or maybe a Seventh-day Adventist perspective. And I see the source. It helps me to understand where that article is coming from and to interpret it accordingly. You get information from AI, who knows where it comes from? It has no convictions and no opinions about right or wrong. The only thing it will try to do is to give you whatever you want, whatever you ask for. Someone has described AI as word vomit. In other words, it takes all it is fed, mixes it together, and then spits it back out at you. So one caution is that it has no filters. A second caution is that it is intentionally designed to copy or to imitate the human brain, which is the most complex organ in our body. Now remember, your mind is the most valuable resource God gave you. No one would choose to use an artificial leg if they had two good legs of their own. No one would choose to go for kidney dialysis if their kidneys are functioning fine. Don't replace the genuine intelligence and the ability to think that God gave you with something else. Be careful about resourcing the responsibility to think. Some things I will outsource. Some things I will not outsource because it's important to me how it's done. I care deeply about them. God expects us to think and to work for what we get. A third concern, or a caution, is that AI can be a shortcut that sidesteps necessarily thinking patterns and learning development. Now, when our children go to elementary school, or maybe before, they are not taught only how to push buttons on a calculator. They are taught mathematics. They are taught that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 4 plus 4 equals 8. They are taught the multiplication tables. They would not need to know that if they have a calculator, but it's important that they know that. We teach our students how to spell, not only how to use spell check. And God expects us to develop our thinking and not just to depend on others' thinking. Now, having said that, artificial intelligence is a tool. I'm not saying it may not be used. I'm saying be cautious, because some tools can be dangerous. I never left a 5-year-old run a chainsaw because it could be very dangerous. A chainsaw can cut up a tree that blew down in your yard, or it can cut off your foot. It's a tool. It's valuable, but it can be dangerous. A computer is a tool. The internet is a tool. Google is a tool. And AI as well is a tool. And if they are used, they need to be used responsibly. So make sure you learn how to do that. Now, I gave you 7 things here, or 6. The last was a question. If you allow these things to occupy your mind, things like bitterness, unforgiveness, a spirit of fear, love of money, if these things fill our minds and control our minds, you are not girding up the loins of your minds. It's the opposite. It's like tying your legs together so that you can't run, like hobbling a horse. We are talking about the most holy place of our minds. Nadab and Abihu brought strange fire into the temple, that which was not holy and approved of God, and they lost their lives because of it. And if we allow strange fire to fill our minds, to occupy our minds, we are living dangerously. Our spiritual lives are in jeopardy. Let's move on to the disciplined mind. The disciplined mind requires effort and it requires focus. Going back to the verse we read earlier, 1 Peter 1:13 says, "Wherefore gird up the loins of your mind." And this was an expression that was used. A similar expression today might be, roll up your sleeves, get to work, get down to it, put your nose to the grindstone. Or depending what activities you're familiar with, in the world of racing, it's, gentlemen, start your engines. Get ready. We're ready to move. We're ready to go. It means being prepared and eager to engage in something, knowing that it's going to require a challenge. God himself used this expression several times in speaking to Job. Near the end of the book of Job, he says, "Gird up now thy loins like a man, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want some answers. Another expression we might use today is put your big boy pants on. It's time to get to it. I want some answers. And this disciplined mind requires focus. I read Philippians 4:8 already. If there be any virtue and if there be any praise, think on these things. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 5. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. I'm challenged by that verse. There are times when I don't need to concentrate on what I'm doing. Maybe I'm driving down the road and my mind can wander to who knows where. Am I bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ? Where does your mind go when you have time in your hands? Is your default response to turn the music on? Or maybe to listen to something else? That can be appropriate sometimes. It can be inspiring, uplifting. You might listen to audiobooks or audio Bible or recorded sermons, and these are good things. But even these things are, in a sense, just allowing your mind to follow the thoughts of someone else. Can you spend time in silence, alone, without any music on, without any recordings on, and make it a profitable time? Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Jesus Christ. Maybe it's meditating on Scripture. Maybe it's praying. Maybe it's memorizing a verse or quoting verses you've already memorized. Just focusing on that time with God. Remember, the most holy place was filled with the presence of God. Is your mind filled with the presence of God? What comes out when you are all alone and have time? Let's look just briefly at the renewed mind. In the Old Testament, Josiah saw a need to cleanse the temple. Years of filth had accumulated there. He cleaned it out. In the New Testament, Jesus also saw a need to cleanse the temple. He said, take these things hence, get them out of here. And perhaps as you looked at this list of things from which we need to protect our minds, maybe you realize that there are some things occupying your minds that don't belong there. And if that's the case, it may be time to cleanse your temple, to cleanse the most holy place of your temple. Ask God. Ask Him to deliver you from those harmful, habitual thinking patterns that are filling your mind. Several verses, and we'll bring this to a close. Psalm 51. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence. Take not thy Holy Spirit unto me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. Romans 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies, this is the temple of God, remember, present your bodies, a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God. This is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to the thought patterns of this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your minds, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Philippians 2:5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. One of the verses that you read at the beginning of this sermon was about the glory and presence of God filling the temple. And the context of that passage says that Moses wasn't even able to enter the tabernacle because it was so full of the presence of God. And if your minds are filled with the presence of God, that is the best way to keep these other things out of your mind. Fill your minds with the presence and glory of God. And then as I was thinking about this veil that protected the most holy place, there came a day when that veil was rent in twain from top to bottom because it was no longer needed. There's coming a day when the protections we set in place will no longer be needed because we will be in the presence of God and we will be in the presence of His glory. What a day that will be. My closing challenge to you for this week and beyond is to think about what you think about. And is your mind filled with the presence and glory of God? Make it a habit to control your mind. I invite you to stand for prayer. We're going to do our prayer a little bit differently today. We're going to pray together as we sing this verse from Psalm 19. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Let's sing this together and make it our prayer. Let the word